The Wyoming flats were a place where the wind scoured the earth, leaving behind dust devils that danced like ghosts under a pale, unforgiving sun. It was a land of harsh horizons and deep silence, a silence Calder Boone had come to mistake for peace. He rode the northern fence line of his property, his horse a stoic dun gelding named Shale, moving with the familiar rocking gait that had measured out the last 4 years of Calder's life. He was a man worn lean by work and memory. The faint blue of his old cavalry coat faded to the gray of a stormy sky. The air was still too still, the kind of oppressive quiet that often precedes violence. Calder reined Shale in at the crest of a low ridge, his gaze sweeping the vast expanse. Below him, the dusty ribbon of the Cheyenne Trail snaked through the sagebrush. And on it, a splash of color, a Concord stagecoach, its lacquered red panels glinting in the afternoon light, pulled by a team of 4 bays. It was an uncommon sight this far from the main fork, likely a private charter. Calder watched for a moment, a flicker of something almost like curiosity stirring in the quiet emptiness of his routine. Then, from a rocky outcrop, a quarter-mile down the trail, the world exploded. The crack of rifles echoed flat and ugly across the plains. Puffs of white smoke blossomed from the rocks. The lead horses of the stagecoach team screamed and went down in a tangle of leather and kicking legs. The coach lurched, tipping precariously, before crashing onto its side with a sound of splintering wood that reached Calder even at this distance. Men on horseback burst from the rocks, their figures small and dark against the landscape. More shots followed, sharp and methodical. The driver, thrown from his seat, was cut down before he could find his feet. A guard on the roof returned fire once, then crumpled over the edge and fell from sight. Calder's hand went instinctively to the Winchester rifle, holstered at his saddle. His heart hammered against his ribs, with a rhythm he hadn't felt since the war, a brutal drumbeat of pure metallic fear. He was too far to intervene, too exposed. To ride down there now would be suicide. All he could do was watch as the outlaws swarmed the wreckage. He saw them pull a man from the coach, a passenger in a fine city coat, and shoot him without ceremony. A woman's scream was cut brutally short. The bandits moved with a chilling efficiency, not like common highwaymen after a strong box, but like executioners. He stayed frozen, a statue of impotent fury, as they ransacked the coach-loaded bags onto their horses and galloped away, disappearing back into the maze of arroyos and canyons to the east. The silence that fell in their wake was heavier, more profound than before. It was a dead silence, thick with the smell of gunpowder that the breeze carried up the ridge. For a long time, Calder did not move. Part of him, the part that had built this solitary life as a fortress, screamed at him to turn Shale around and ride back to the cabin. This was not his fight. He had left the world of men and their savagery behind in the muddy fields of Tennessee. But another part, a stubborn, buried piece of the man he used to be, urged him forward. He couldn't just leave them there. He nudged Shale into a slow, cautious walk down the slope. As he drew closer, the scene resolved into a tableau of horror. The horses lay dead in their harnesses, their eyes glassy. The driver and the guard were sprawled in the dust, their blood already turning dark under the sun. The passenger in the city coat lay near the overturned door, his face a mask of shock. Calder dismounted his rifle, held ready, every sense on high alert. He circled the wreckage, his boots crunching on shattered glass. The inside of the coach was a mess of torn upholstery and scattered belongings. A woman lay inside, her fine dress ruined her life, ended with the same brutal finality as the others. He felt a familiar hollowness in his chest. This was the work of men who wanted no witnesses. It was then he heard it. A faint sound, almost a sigh, from behind a large sagebrush near the front of the wreckage. Calder raised his Winchester, his voice a low rasp. "Who's there?" There was no answer, only the rustle of movement. He advanced slowly, circling the brush. Lying in the dirt, half hidden, was a woman. She was young Apache by the sharp line of her cheekbones and the long black hair that fanned out around her head, like spilled ink. Her dress was torn, her skin streaked with dirt and blood from a gash on her forehead. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes closed. At first, he thought she was dead too. But then her fingers twitched, clutching something at her throat. It was a chain, fine and silver. He knelt beside her, his rifle laid carefully in the dust. Her skin was cold to the touch. He gently worked his fingers under the chain, trying to check the clasp, thinking it might be choking her. As he lifted it, a silver locket, tarnished and dented, fell into his palm. It was warm from her skin. Instinctively, he pressed the catch. It sprang open. Inside, behind a small, cracked pane of glass, was a faded tintype portrait of a woman. She was fair-haired with a gentle smile and sad, knowing eyes that seemed to look right through him. Calder's breath caught in his throat. His heart stopped, then restarted with a painful, violent lurch. He knew that face. He hadn't seen it in 15 years, not since the smoke and chaos of the Shiloh retreat, but he had never forgotten it. It was the face of Eleanor Kane, the wife of a fellow officer in his regiment. A man named Silas. A man Calder had last seen lying in the mud, begging for help as the enemy line advanced. A man Calder had been forced to leave behind to save his own skin. His mind reeled. What was Eleanor's portrait doing around the neck of a dying Apache woman in the middle of the Wyoming Territory? The violence he had just witnessed was no longer a random tragedy. It was a ghost from his past, reaching out across the years to drag him back into the very hell he had tried so desperately to escape. He looked down at the unconscious woman at his feet, then back at the locket in his hand. His solitary peace was shattered. He had a choice to make: leave her to her fate and ride away, or pick up this thread of his past and see where it led. He closed the locket with a soft click, the sound sealing his decision. Cursing himself, his past, and whatever cruel fate had brought this to his doorstep, Calder Boone carefully lifted the woman into his arms. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her weight a fragile burden. He carried her to his horse mounted and turned Shale not toward the law in Cheyenne, but toward the isolation of his cabin. He was a man hiding from his ghosts, and one of them had just been delivered bleeding to his fence line. The cabin was Calder's penance, a simple box of hand-hewn logs and chinked mud, built against a low rise that offered some protection from the winter winds. Inside, it was spare and functional. A stone fireplace, a rough planked table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a single cot against the far wall. It was a space designed for one man and his thoughts, and for 4 years it had served its purpose, keeping the world at a safe distance. Now that distance had collapsed. He laid the Apache woman gently on his cot, the unfamiliar presence seeming to shrink the small room. Her breathing was still faint, a fragile flutter in her chest. For a man accustomed to the clean, brutal wounds of battle, her injuries were unsettling. The gash on her forehead was deep, and a dark bruise was already purpling along her jaw. Her feet, he now saw, were bare and raw, blistered and cut as if she'd been running for miles over sharp rock. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency that was another relic of the war. He fetched the water bucket, tearing a clean strip from an old shirt to wash the blood and grime from her face. Her features beneath the dirt were finer than he'd first thought, her mouth set in a stubborn line, even in unconsciousness. He cleaned and stitched the cut on her forehead with a needle and thread from his mending kit, his large, calloused hands surprisingly steady. He coated her ravaged feet in a salve he used for saddle sores, the sharp scent of pine tar filling the air. All the while, the silver locket sat on the table, a silent, damning accusation. He kept glancing at it at the closed secret it held. Eleanor Kane. He remembered her visiting the camp once before the big push south. She'd had a quiet grace that seemed out of place among the rough noise of the soldiers. She'd smiled at him, that same sad, knowing smile from the photograph. And Silas. Silas had been a different sort. Ambitious with a sharp tongue and an air of educated superiority that rubbed many of the men the wrong way. He'd been obsessed with his family's name, their wealth back east. Calder had seen him last, with a piece of shrapnel in his leg, his face pale with shock and pain. The order had come to fall back a full panicked retreat. To stop for one man would have meant death for them all. Calder had met Silas's eyes for a moment, then turned and ran with the others. He told himself it was the only choice. He had never been sure if he believed it. He finished tending to the woman, covering her with his thickest wool blanket. He built up the fire in the hearth, the flames casting dancing shadows that made the cabin feel crowded with ghosts. He sat in the chair opposite the cot, his rifle across his knees, and waited. The sun bled out of the sky, and darkness settled over the flats, bringing with it the familiar howl of the wind. But tonight, the sound wasn't lonely. It was menacing. By bringing her here, he had broken his own cardinal rule. He had let the outside world in. Trouble had a way of following people like her, and the men who had attacked that stagecoach were not the kind to leave loose ends. They had killed everyone else. They would assume she was dead, but if they learned otherwise, they would come looking. And his isolated cabin, his fortress, would become a target. He was no longer just Calder Boone, a quiet rancher. He was a man harboring a secret, a man tied by a silver locket to a past he could not outrun. The decision to help her had been an impulse, a flicker of an old, buried duty. Now in the quiet of the cabin, the consequences began to settle in his gut like cold stones. He was protecting a stranger, but he was also, in some strange way, trying to atone for the man he had left behind in the mud 15 years ago. He watched her chest rise and fall, a fragile rhythm in the deep silence, and knew his life had irrevocably changed. The quiet was over. She woke near dawn. Calder was dozing in the chair, his head slumped against his chest, the rifle still held loosely in his hands. A small sound, a sharp intake of breath, brought him instantly awake. Her eyes were open wide and dark with terror. She scrambled backward on the cot, pulling the blanket up to her chin like a shield, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room before locking on him. "Easy, Calder," said his voice, a low, gravelly rumble. He made no move to stand, keeping his posture deliberately non-threatening. "You're safe here." The word safe seemed to mean nothing to her. Her body was coiled tight as a spring, ready to bolt. He could see the frantic calculation in her eyes as she assessed him the room, the single door. "Water," he offered, nodding toward the cup on the small crate beside the cot. She stared at the cup, then back at him, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She didn't speak. She didn't move. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind. Calder understood. She was a cornered animal, and he was the stranger who had dragged her back to his den. Trust was a currency she didn't have to spend. He let out a slow breath and stood moving with deliberate slowness. He went to the stove, stirred the ashes, and began the familiar ritual of making coffee. The simple domestic sounds, the clink of the tin pot and the splash of water, were an attempt to build a bridge of normalcy across the chasm of her fear. He didn't look at her, giving her space to observe him without feeling trapped by his gaze. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 cups. He set one on the edge of the table as far from him and as close to her as he could manage a silent offering. He took his own back to his chair by the fire. "It's hot," he said, and said no more. For a long time, she remained motionless. Then slowly, inch by inch, she swung her legs over the side of the cot. He saw her wince as her bandaged feet touched the cold floorboards. She limped toward the table, her eyes never leaving him, snatched the cup, and retreated to the relative safety of the cot. She cradled the warm tin in her hands, but she didn't drink. She just watched him over the rim, her expression a mask of wary distrust. Later that morning, the distant ring of an axe broke the quiet. From the town of Redemption, 10 miles to the west, Silas Kane stepped off the morning train. He was a man who wore his tailored suit and polished boots like armor, a stark contrast to the dusty, wind-scoured town. His hair was streaked with silver at the temples, but his eyes were the same sharp, intelligent blue. Calder remembered only now they held a cold, predatory gleam. He walked directly to the sheriff's office, his cane tapping a measured rhythm on the boardwalk. Sheriff Miller was a weary man, whose shoulders slumped with the weight of upholding the law in a land that barely recognized it. He looked up from his paperwork as Silas entered his office, suddenly seeming smaller. Sheriff Miller's Silas began, his voice smooth and cultured, a voice that did not belong in this town. "My name is Silas Kane. I have come on a most tragic errand." He placed his hat on the corner of the desk. "I chartered a private coach to bring my brother and his wife west. They were to meet me here. They never arrived." Miller leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed. "Private coach, that's unusual." "My brother's wife Eleanor was of a delicate constitution," Silas said, a flicker of what looked like grief crossing his face. "We were hoping the dry air would be a comfort to her. They were traveling with a guide, an Apache girl." "We'll send a rider out along the trail," Miller said, reaching for a notepad. "Thank you, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice laced with practiced sorrow. "I must confess, however, to another concern. My brother was carrying a substantial sum of money, an inheritance we were to invest together. I fear they may have met with foul play." "And the girl?" "She was a last-minute addition to their party. A local. I never fully trusted her." He let the implication hang in the air. The weary sheriff sighed. It was an old story, the untrustworthy native, the missing money. It was the easiest explanation. "We'll look for her too, Mr. Kane," he said. Silas Kane smiled, a thin, cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I would be most grateful, Sheriff. Most grateful." He left the office and walked to the town's only saloon. Two rough-looking men who had been waiting at a corner table stood as he approached. "Any sign of her tracks leading away from the site?" Silas asked, his voice losing its polished edge, becoming hard and flat. "None, boss," the older one said. "We circled wide. It's like she vanished, or she's still out there dead in a ditch." "She is not dead," Silas said with chilling certainty. "She is a survivor, and she is a witness. Find her. Scour every ranch, every homestead within 20 miles. I want her found, and I want the locket she carries." He laid a few gold coins on the table. "And when you find the person who has her, remind them that harboring a thief is a crime." The net was cast. As Calder watched the woman in his cabin finally take a tentative sip of coffee, the unseen threads of Silas Kane's vengeance were already tightening around them both. The days that followed were a quiet, careful dance. Calder moved with a deliberate rhythm, tending to his cattle, mending his fences, doing the 1,000 small chores that made up his solitary life. But now, he did them with one ear, always listening for the sound of hoofbeats on the trail. He was acutely aware of Nia. She had whispered her name to him on the second day, a single word that felt like a monumental concession. Nia remained mostly silent, but her fear slowly began to recede, replaced by a sharp, watchful intelligence. She observed everything: the way he banked the fire at night, where he kept his ammunition, how he tested the wind before riding out. On the third day, Calder returned from checking the southern pasture to find she had swept the floor with a makeshift broom and had neatly folded the blankets on the cot. It was a small gesture, but it was a claim on the space, a sign that she was more than just a frightened refugee. He began to talk to her, not expecting answers, but simply to fill the silence. He told her about his horse, about the stubbornness of his cattle, about the way a storm looked coming over the plains. He was speaking more than he had in years, and he found the sound of his own voice strange in the quiet cabin. One afternoon he was cleaning his rifle at the table when she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "You were a soldier." It wasn't a question. Calder looked up surprised. She nodded toward the faded cavalry coat hanging on a peg by the door. "The coat." "A long time ago," he said, his voice tight. "You fight good?" she asked, her gaze steady. He didn't answer immediately, the memory of the retreat of Silas Kane's face flashing in his mind. "I survived," he said finally, which was the only truth that mattered. The tentative peace was broken a week after her arrival. Calder had ridden to the stagecoach wreckage, a grim necessity he had been putting off. He needed to know if he'd missed anything, any clue as to what had really happened. The scavengers had already been there. The coach was stripped bare and the bodies were gone, likely found by a patrol and buried in unmarked graves. But as he circled the area, he found something the others had missed, a small leather-bound journal half buried in the dust. The name Eleanor Kane was embossed in faded gold on the cover. He took it back to the cabin. That evening, by the light of the lantern, he opened it. Eleanor's handwriting was elegant, her entries filled with descriptions of the landscape and her hopes for a new life out west. But as the entries progressed, a thread of fear wove through her words. She wrote of her husband's brother Silas, who was to meet them. She described him as a man of charming words and cold ambition, a man her husband both admired and feared. The last entry, dated the day of the attack, was chilling. "Silas sent word he would ride out to meet us on the trail, a surprise. George is pleased, but I feel a dread I cannot name. Silas spoke so often of the inheritance, of how this land would belong to the stronger Kane. I pray my fears are just a woman's fancy." Calder closed the journal, his blood running cold. This wasn't a robbery. It was a planned assassination. Silas had murdered his own brother for an inheritance, and Nia had seen it all. She wasn't a thief. She was the sole witness to a fratricide. He looked over at Nia, who was mending a tear in her dress, her head bent in concentration. The weight of his responsibility to her settled on him with crushing force. He had to tell her what he knew, had to understand what she had seen. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the cot where she was working. He placed the silver locket on the blanket between them. "Nia," he began, his voice low, "I need you to tell me what happened. The woman in this locket, Eleanor, I need to know." Her hands stilled. She looked at the locket, then at his face, and for the first time, he saw not just fear in her eyes, but a deep, haunting sorrow. She began to speak, her English halting, pieced together with gestures, her voice barely a whisper. She told him she had been hired as a guide for the Kanes. She described the man who rode out to meet them, a man with a cold smile, who called George brother. She recounted how he and his men had appeared, how they had gunned down George and the guards without mercy. Eleanor had screamed Silas's name, begging him, and he had shot her himself. Nia had scrambled from the coach in the chaos, a stray bullet grazing her head and knocking her unconscious just as she reached the cover of the brush. She had been clutching the locket, a gift Eleanor had given her earlier that day, as a token of friendship. When she'd woken, it was to the sound of Calder's voice. As she finished, a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Calder felt a surge of cold fury. This wasn't just about his past anymore. It was about the woman in front of him and the monster who was hunting her. The man who did this, Calder said, his voice hard as iron. His name is Silas Kane. He watched for a flicker of recognition, but her expression was one of confused grief. The name meant nothing to her, but it meant everything to him. He now understood the full, horrifying truth. He was protecting the only witness to a murder committed by a man he had left for dead, a man whose wife's face was etched in his memory. His past and present had just collided with the force of a cannonball. The fight wasn't coming to his door anymore. It was already inside. A few days later, a near miss solidified their shared danger. Calder was splitting wood in the yard when he caught movement on the far ridge. Two riders silhouetted against the sky. They were too far away for a clear view, but they weren't cowboys. They sat their horses like hunters, their attention fixed on the valley on his cabin. They were Silas's men scouting. Calder's hand tightened on the axe handle. He didn't move, didn't give any sign he'd seen them, and after a long, tense 10 minutes, they turned and rode off. He went back inside, his jaw set. "They're looking," he said to Nia. "They know someone could have survived." That night, for the first time, Nia spoke her native Apache tongue to herself, a soft, rhythmic series of sounds as she stared into the fire. Calder didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was a prayer or a lament. He realized then how truly alone she was, cut off, not just from her people, but from her own language. His world had become her only refuge. The knowledge that Silas was not just a ghost from the past, but an active present threat, forced Calder's hand. He needed supplies, but more than that, he needed information. He had to go to Redemption. He left Nia the next morning with a heavy sense of foreboding. "Keep the door barred," he instructed, handing her his spare rifle. "Don't open it for anyone. Fire a shot if you see riders. I'll hear it." She took the heavy weapon, her small frame seeming to gain strength from its weight. She nodded, her eyes dark and serious. "Be safe, Calder." The town of Redemption was a single dusty street, lined with false-fronted buildings. As Calder tied Shale to the hitching post outside the general store, he felt the weight of curious eyes on him. He was a familiar stranger, the reclusive rancher who kept to himself. Today his presence felt like a vulnerability. It felt like... Inside the store, the proprietor, a gossipy man named Henderson, eyed him over his spectacles. "Boone. Didn't expect to see you in. Heard you might have some trouble out your way." Calder's gut tightened. What kind of trouble? That fancy fella Kane, the one whose brother got himself killed on the trail? He's been in town buying drinks, telling stories. Says the Apache girl who was with them likely led the robbers right to them. Says anyone helping her is as good as an accomplice. Henderson leaned forward conspiratorially. He's put up a reward for her. $500. Calder's blood ran cold. $500. Enough money to turn any desperate man into a hunter. Silas wasn't just searching. He was turning the entire territory against Nia, and by extension, against him. He bought his supplies, flour, coffee, and more ammunition, his face an unreadable mask, and left the store. As he was untying Shale, a voice from behind him, smooth and laced with venom, stopped him cold. "Well, I'll be. Calder Boone. I'd heard you survived the war, but I never thought I'd see the day." Calder turned slowly. Silas Kane stood on the boardwalk, leaning on his silver-headed cane. He looked older, harder, but his eyes held the same arrogant fire Calder remembered. The guise of the grieving brother was gone, replaced by a look of undisguised contempt. Silas Calder said, his voice flat. "I should have known," Silas sneered, taking a step closer. A man who runs from a fight is just the sort to hide in the wilderness. Tell me, Boone, does your conscience ever trouble you at night? Or did you bury it in that Tennessee mud along with me? You were a casualty of war. Calder said, his hand resting near the butt of his revolver. Was I Silas's smile was a razor slash, or was I a casualty of your cowardice? You were an officer. You could have held the line. Instead, you ran. You left us all to die. He gestured with his cane toward his leg. This is your legacy, Boone. A constant reminder of the man who chose his own skin over his duty. The street seemed to fall silent around them. People were stopping to watch the confrontation. I'm here about the girl, Boone. Silas continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. The little savage. She has something of mine. A family heirloom. You give her to me, and I'll forget I ever saw you. We can let the past die. She has nothing that belongs to you. Calder said, his gaze unwavering. Silas's eyes narrowed into icy slits. You always did have a misplaced sense of honor. Very well. But know this world is small, and there is nowhere you can hide where I won't find you. I am a man who finishes what he starts. He tapped his cane once on the boardwalk, a sharp final sound. And I will have what is mine. Silas turned and walked away, leaving Calder standing in the middle of the street, the weight of every eye in town on him. The confrontation had drawn a line in the sand. He was no longer an anonymous rancher. He was the man protecting Silas Kane's quarry. He had been publicly marked. He swung into the saddle and rode out of town, not looking back. He knew Silas's psychological war had just begun. He had isolated him, turned the town against him. Now the only person he could rely on was Naya. And the only place they were safe, or so he hoped, was the cabin. But as he rode, he felt the first cold sting of snow in the air. The weather was turning. The sky was turning gray, mirroring the cold dread in his heart. The final battle was coming, and the world was about to shrink to the size of one small wooden cabin. The blizzard hit 2 days later. It did not arrive with the fury of a sudden squall, but with a creeping, insidious chill that leached the color from the sky and stole the warmth from the earth. The wind began as a whisper through the eaves, a lonely secret shared with the cabin, before swelling to a mournful howl, and then a predatory scream. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a driving horizontal sheet that erased the horizon, the fence lines, the entire world, leaving only a swirling vortex of white. Inside the cabin, Calder and Nia were trapped. The dim light from the single lantern cast long, dancing shadows that writhed on the walls like living things. Every gust of wind hammered the shutters, the sound like a fist trying to break in. The temperature plummeted. They stuffed rags into the cracks around the door and window frames, a futile effort against the relentless cold. He will use this. Naya said, her voice quiet but certain as she stared into the fire. The storm will hide him. I know, Calder replied. He was cleaning his Winchester for the 3rd time that day, the repetitive, methodical action, a small anchor in the chaos. He'll think we're blind and deaf in this. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were immediate, tangible, measured in the dwindling pile of firewood and the number of rounds he had for his rifle. But it was more than just physical survival. It was a moral reckoning. Every howl of the wind sounded like an accusation from his past. He was trapped not just with Nia and the storm, but with the ghost of Silas Kane and the choice he had made 15 years ago. The attack came just after nightfall, under the deepest cover of the blizzard's rage. There was no warning, no sound of approaching horses. Just a sudden, violent crash as the single window of the cabin exploded inward, showering the floor with glass and snow. A figure in a heavy coat lunged through the opening, a pistol in his hand. Calder was already moving. He fired the Winchester from his hip, the roar of the rifle deafening in the small space. The man grunted and fell back out of the window, his body a dark shape quickly swallowed by the snow. "The door," Calder yelled. Nia was already there, dropping the heavy bar into place, just as a massive force slammed against it from the outside, shaking the entire cabin. Wood splintered. "Stay away from the window," he ordered, pushing the table onto its side to create a barrier. He handed Nia his revolver. "You know how to use this. Don't fire unless they're inside." 6 shots. She took the gun, her 2 hands wrapped around the grip, her face pale but resolved in the flickering lantern light. Another shape appeared at the shattered window. Calder fired again, and the shape vanished. They were testing him, drawing his fire, counting his shots. Outside, a voice cut through the storm, magnified and distorted by the wind. It was Silas. "It's no use, Boone. You're trapped like a rat in a barrel. Did you think you could hide from me forever?" A fusillade of bullets tore through the thin cabin walls, ripping through blankets, thudding into the log beams. Calder and Nia dropped to the floor, splinters raining down on them. The lantern glass shattered, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the hellish orange glow of the fireplace. "This isn't about some girl," Boone, Silas's voice, howled, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "This has always been about you and me, about what you did." The assault on the door began in earnest, the rhythmic thud of a heavy log being used as a battering ram. The wood groaned, cracking under the strain. "Nia, the fireplace!" Calder shouted over the din. "Get the poker!" She crawled to the hearth, her silhouette stark against the flames, and grabbed the heavy iron poker. The door hinges screamed, then ripped free. The door burst inward with a final explosive crack, and 2 men stumbled in their forms, huge and monstrous, against the swirling white chaos behind them. The first man raised his pistol, but Nia was faster. She lunged, swinging the poker in a desperate arc that connected with his wrist. Bones crunched, the pistol clattered to the floor, and the man screamed. Calder shot the second man before he could even raise his weapon. And then Silas Kane stepped through the ruined doorway. He was not dressed for a blizzard. He wore his fine city coat, now dusted with snow, and in his hand he held a sleek, pearl-handled revolver. His face was a mask of incandescent rage, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it seemed to generate its own heat. "Just you and me now, Boone," he hissed, kicking the body of his man out of the way. He ignored Nia, his entire focus a laser beam fixed on Calder. "It's over, Silas," Calder said, leveling his rifle. "You murdered your brother. She saw it all." Silas laughed, a chilling, unhinged sound. "My brother. He was a weak, sentimental fool just like his father. He would have squandered our family's legacy. I did what was necessary. But you don't understand what you cost me that day." He took a step into the cabin, the wind and snow billowing in around him. "You think my grudge is about a little shrapnel, about being left behind?" His voice cracked raw with a 15-year-old pain. "When you gave the order to retreat at Shiloh, you didn't just leave me to die, Boone. You left my son." Calder stared, his mind struggling to comprehend. "Your son?" Michael Silas screamed, his face contorting in agony. "My boy. He was serving as a drummer boy in our regiment. He was only 14. He was right behind you. When you ran the line broke and they swarmed us, I saw them cut him down while I lay there helpless in the mud, my legs shattered. You didn't just abandon a soldier, Boone. You abandoned my child. My vendetta isn't about greed. It's about the empty chair at my table for the last 15 years. It's about the son you let die." The revelation hit Calder with the force of a physical blow. The nightmares, the flashes of a small uniformed figure, the sound of a drum. It all coalesced into a single, horrifying image. He hadn't just made a tactical decision. He had shattered a man's world. His sin was infinitely greater than he had ever imagined. In that moment of stunned horror, Silas lunged. He didn't fire his gun. He threw himself at Calder, and the two men crashed to the floor. The rifle flew from Calder's grasp. It was a desperate, brutal struggle. They rolled across the floor, grunting and cursing, their fight illuminated by the firelight. Silas was fueled by years of festering hatred, his fingers clawing for Calder's eyes. Calder was fighting for more than his own life now. He was fighting for Nia, for the quiet future he had only just begun to imagine. He was fighting for a chance at redemption that he now knew he could never truly earn, but had to try for anyway. He managed to shove Silas off him, scrambling for his rifle. As his fingers closed around the stock, he saw Nia. She wasn't cowering. She stood with the heavy revolver held in both hands, aimed squarely at Silas. But she wasn't firing. Her eyes were locked with Calder's, and in them he saw the terrible choice. This was his demon to face. Silas staggered to his feet, raising his own pistol. Time seemed to slow. The howl of the wind, the crackle of the fire, the pounding of his own heart. He saw the flash from Silas's barrel. At the same instant, he pulled the trigger on his Winchester. A searing pain tore through Calder's shoulder. He was thrown backward against the wall, his arm going numb. But his own shot had been true. Silas stood frozen for a second, a look of shocked surprise on his face. A dark red stain blossomed on the front of his fine coat. He looked down at his chest, then back at Calder, his mouth opening as if to say one last thing. But only a gurgle of blood came out. He crumpled to the floor and lay still. The silence that descended was absolute. The wind still raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was only the sound of the fire and Calder's own ragged breathing. He slumped against the wall, clutching his shoulder, the pain a dull, throbbing roar. Nia rushed to his side, dropping the revolver. Her eyes were wide with shock, but her hands were steady as she pressed a strip of cloth against his bleeding wound. He looked past her at the body of Silas Kane lying in the ruin of the doorway, snow drifting in to cover him like a shroud. The fight was over. His past was dead. But the cost of it was written in blood on the floor of his home. The blizzard broke with the dawn. The wind died, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a pristine, silent blanket of white. The sun rose on a landscape of profound stillness, the light glinting off the snow with a painful crystalline beauty. Inside the cabin, the scene was one of grim devastation. The floor was littered with debris, the walls were scarred with bullet holes, and the bodies of Silas Kane and his men lay where they had fallen. Calder was propped against the wall, pale and feverish, his shoulder crudely bandaged. Nia had worked through the night, her face a mask of exhaustion and grim determination. She had cleaned his wound as best she could, her touch gentle but firm, and had managed to stop the bleeding. Now she sat by the fire, the revolver across her lap, watching the trail. They didn't have to wait long. Around mid-morning, a group of riders appeared, dark figures moving slowly through the deep snow. It was Sheriff Miller and a posse of townsmen. A neighboring rancher miles away had heard the gunfire before the storm hit its peak and had ridden for town as soon as the snow had stopped. The sheriff took in the scene with a weary sigh, his gaze moving from the bodies to Calder's wound, to the steadfast girl holding a pistol. "Boone," he said, his voice heavy, "you've got a hell of a lot of explaining to do." And so Calder told him. He told him everything, his voice raspy and weak. He told him about the stagecoach, about finding Nia, about the locket. He told him about recognizing Silas from the war. And finally, with Nia's quiet corroboration, he told him about the journal, about Eleanor Kane's fears, and about Silas's confession of fratricide. Nia retrieved the journal from its hiding place and handed it to the sheriff. Miller read through the last few entries, his expression growing grimmer with each page. He looked at Silas Kane's cold, peaceful face, then back at Calder. The story, as wild as it was, fit the facts. The ruthlessness of the stagecoach attack, Kane's obsessive hunt, the final desperate siege. It wasn't the work of a man seeking a stolen heirloom. It was the work of a murderer silencing a witness. The posse removed the bodies, wrapping them in blankets and tying them over their saddles. The town doctor tended to Calder's shoulder, extracting the bullet with a grunt and a liberal splash of whiskey. Through it all, Nia never left his side. When they were finally alone again, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was not the tense quiet of waiting for a fight, nor the empty silence of solitude. It was a quiet of exhaustion, of survival, of shared trauma that had forged a bond stronger than steel. They were both wounded physically and emotionally, but they were alive, and they were together. The seasons turned. The great snows melted, feeding the creeks and turning the Wyoming flats green with new grass. The spring was a time of slow, painful healing. Calder's shoulder mended, leaving behind a puckered scar and a permanent ache that flared up with the cold. But the deeper wounds, the ones in his soul, began to heal too. The nightmares of the Shiloh retreat faded, replaced by the quiet reality of his life with Nia. She healed beside him. The haunted look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a calm strength. She began to smile, more small, genuine smiles that made Calder's heart ache in a way he hadn't known was possible. She planted a small garden behind the cabin, her hands turning the soil with a hopeful energy. The cabin, once his fortress of isolation, became a home filled with the smell of baking bread and the sound of her quiet humming. The silence he had once craved was now filled with a life he hadn't dared to dream of. Late one summer afternoon, when the sky was a deep, cloudless blue, and the cottonwood leaves whispered in the breeze, Calder dug a small hole on a rise overlooking the creek. He took the silver locket from the mantelpiece where it had sat since the blizzard. It felt heavy in his hand, a repository of so much pain and loss. Nia came and stood beside him. Together, they looked at the faded portrait of Eleanor Kane one last time, a silent prayer for a woman they had never truly known, but whose life had irrevocably shaped their own. Calder placed the locket in the bottom of the hole. It glinted once in the sun before Nia covered it with a handful of dark, rich earth. Then into the hole, Calder placed the roots of a young cottonwood sapling he had carried up from the creek bed. They filled the hole together, packing the earth firmly around the young tree. It was a small, fragile thing, but its leaves were green and full of life. It was a promise, an act of laying the past to rest, of choosing to grow something new and beautiful in its place. They stood there for a long moment, side by side, their hands linked. The ranch was peaceful. The world felt vast and full of possibility. Nia turned to him, her dark eyes soft in the afternoon light. She took his free hand, the one with the rough, calloused fingers, and gently placed it on her stomach. Beneath his palm, he felt the subtle, firm curve that he had not noticed until now. A new life, a new beginning conceived in the quiet space after the storm. "Our future, Calder," she whispered, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable joy. He looked from her face to the sapling, and then out at the wide, open land that stretched before them. The ghosts were gone, buried with the locket. All that was left was the sun on his face, the woman by his side, and the promise of a life they would build together.